Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how many of you are habitually frequent a site called Twitter. Well, I happen to do that sometimes. And one of the new words which I've discovered in the past few weeks, and I can't say whether its provenance is Indian or somewhere else, is a word called whataboutery. Now, whataboutery basically talks about, if you talk about Paris, someone will say, what about Beirut? If you talk about this, if you talk about Gujarat, someone will say, what about Punjab? And so on and so forth. So this thing, what might be called comparisons of various phenomena, that there is a moral equivalence between various types of evils, between various types of undesirable things, has been a frequent feature of this. And we've seen it very sharply in focus in the latest reactions to the massacre in Paris. In an article which appeared this morning in the Times of London, the historian Neil Ferguson had a very interesting and quaint take on the killings in Paris. And he invoked Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he talked about that the Roman Empire didn't die abruptly. It died over a course of 400 or 500 years, a process of slow decline. And the implication he suggested was that what we are witnessing, in some ways, by its inability to cope with radicalism which is emanating from somewhere in the Orient, is the slow death of Western civilization and an inability to actually confront or even realize the challenges which are there. Now, today we have a galaxy of people with very different experiences and takes on the feature of radicalism. Should I say Islamist radicalism? We have Daniel Pipes, who's written exhaustively, sometimes quite provocatively, on West Asia, particularly the conflict between Israel and Palestine. He's been perceived sometimes to be a partisan of Israel, a point of view I don't necessarily disagree with. We have Tarek Fateh, who's written about the Islamist phenomena, the radicalism which has been there in the West, and locating it within the context of the societies in which they emanate from. And finally, we have Sadanand Dhume, who's done a very interesting book on how that phenomena has emerged in Southeast Asia, particularly in the context of the Bali bombings. Actually, when we talk about these, we are talking about Paris. Today, Paris is today's headlines. Yesterday it was Bali, before that it was London, before that it was Beirut. It's the same phenomena happening over and over again. And the same narrative sometimes keeps cropping back. And so if you read the papers 4 years ago, you might find more or less the same op-eds being written. It's just the details which are missing. But the phenomena, previously it was Al-Qaeda. Now it's ISIS, or some people call it ISIL, or IS, the Islamic State, which is the phenomena. Now, what I would urge each of these speakers to do is to give us their take, given their experiences of the areas which they know. And how do we explain the feature of radicalism? Let's first go into that, and then we can subsequently address how it affects the civilizational course of the world. So should I say Mr. Pipes first?
I've been introduced as controversial, so I will attempt to be controversial. My thesis is simple, that there have been three earth-shaking radicalisms that have challenged civilization in the past century: fascism, communism, and now Islamism. Two of them have basically been marginalized and defeated. One of them remains. The great challenge today is to defeat it as well. Let me begin with some concepts, some thoughts about civilization and radicalism. Civilization can mean two things. It can mean the building up of skills. It can mean humanity, humanism, generosity, the opposite of barbarism. I particularly like the definition of civilization is that where every man gives to every other man the right he claims for himself. Mutuality, generosity. The notion of clash of civilizations became widespread after a 1993 article by the American political scientist Samuel Huntington. He had this notion that looking forward from then, quote, the fundamental source of conflict will be primarily ideological, will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. And he found 7 or 8 such units, including the Hindu unit, the Western, the Confucian, the Japanese, the Islamic, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and maybe African. This got a lot of attention. I don't think it's a useful idea. Civilizations are cultural concepts, they're not political ones. It doesn't work. In fact, if you look closely, there's plenty of conflict within civilizations as he's defined them, such as World War I and World War II, the Iraq-Iran War, today in Syria, Yemen, and Libya. At the same time, there are major alliances across civilizations, such as Russia and India, China and Pakistan, or the United States and Saudi Arabia. So the clash of civilizations idea fails. It does not fit the facts, and it does not help understand. I think more useful than the clash of civilizations is a clash between civilization and barbarism, which brings me to the topic of radicalism. Radicalism is basically a modern concept. So far as I can tell, it goes back 2 centuries to 1813 in French, describing the ideas that came out of the French Revolution. It's a systematic body of concepts, especially about human life or culture. Radical ideology takes the notion of a world understanding and makes it very simple, monochromatic. It can be race, it can be class, it can be religion. Fascism is about race, communism is about class, Islamism is about religion. Since the emergence of modern ideologies, these ideological radicalisms have been the great curse of modern life. Now, as I mentioned earlier, fascism and communism are essentially depleted, essentially defunct. It's now the Islamist era. There's a lot in common between these three phenomena. All of them promote a very compelling way of seeing the world for some people. All of them offer a utopian vision for the future. All of them attract talented individuals. All of them attempt to take over states. All of them use the state for coercive purposes. They try to dominate all of life. They aggress against their neighbors, and they seek a cosmic confrontation with the West. Islamism today is the threat. Tyrannical and brutal governments, aggression, repression. It threatens the whole world. Just to look at South Asia, there's the Taliban in Afghanistan, there's Pakistani radicalism against India, and there's the Bangladeshi persecution of Hindus. How to respond to this threat? There are basically 2 ways to respond to it. Everyone agrees it's a threat, but there are very different ways of understanding how to respond. One way, which I'll characterize as the left, seeks multiculturalism and understanding. The other way, which I characterize as the right, seeks to defeat it. Now, the multicultural understanding is not surprising, given that the left and the Islamists share some important traits in common. As George Galloway, the British politician, put it, the progressive movement, i.e. the left, the progressive movement around the world and the Muslims have the same enemies. And he named Israel, the United States, and Britain. The same political, the two groups, the left and the Islamists, share many causes in common. They opposed the war against Saddam Hussein. They opposed efforts to fight the war on terror. They're both anti-American. They both want the elimination of Israel. They both want mass migration to the West. They both want multiculturalism. The other view, the right view, sees Islamism as an enemy that cannot be accommodated but must be defeated, much as fascism was defeated in the Second World War and communism in the Cold War. There's no way to appease it. There's no way to buy it off. There's no way to change one's foreign policy to accommodate it. It has to be fought and defeated. As Tony Blair put it nearly a decade ago, we are fighting a war about how the world, so let me try that again. We are fighting a war about how the world should govern itself in the early 21st century, about global values. The goal has to be the elimination of Islamism and its replacement with an Islam that is modern, moderate, democratic, humane, liberal, and good neighborly. One that is respectful of women, homosexuals, atheists, one that grants non-Muslims the same rights as Muslims. Looking forward, I see that the attempt to defeat Islamism is rather weak. People get upset by it, but they don't actually do much. On the other hand, Islamism itself has some major faults, some major flaws that may bring it down of its own accord. In particular, the Islamists fight each other. Look at Syria today. In particular, also, Muslims who come under the rule of Islamism don't like it. The best symbol of that would be Egypt, which after 1 year of Islamist rule said no. The largest political demonstration in human history said no, we don't want Islamism. So I see weakness in the fight against Islamism, but I see Islamism also as weak itself. And so in the end, I'm somewhat optimistic that this malign, aggressive force will fall of its own weight, and I'm somewhat optimistic that civilization will survive and barbarism will once again fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pipes. I think you've raised some very interesting questions. Number one is, you have a critique of the approach of multicultural societies towards this threat. But at the same time, you are calling for a reformation, really, of Islam, a reworking of theology. But there is this other bizarre phenomena of the growing attraction of the most brutal form of Islamism amongst a certain section of the youth. I mean, it's quite strange and bizarre that the more you have these beheading videos, you have more and more people going and joining the ISIS, for example, going to Turkey, young girls, age of 15, 16, from Bangladeshi or Pakistani backgrounds in Britain. There are about 2,000, 2,500 of such people in the West, from the West, who've gone and joined them in Turkey and in Syria. And it's suspected that some of the bombers, some of the people the gunmen in Paris may have been trained and came back, and actually they decided to continue the war on other fronts. Now, Tarek Fateh, you've had quite a lot of experiences of witnessing Islamic societies, both from within and from a distance. And I'd like you to take, I believe you want to speak from the podium.
Good afternoon, namaskar, assalamu alaikum. Let me cut to the chase. In 5 years of the Second World War, during which 60 million people died, just 30 million were Russians, we defeated the largest army ever assembled by the Wehrmacht, not to mention large contingents of fascists and Nazis from Romania, some from India. In fact, even the Warsaw Uprising was put down by, surprisingly, a German Muslim regiment called the East Turkmenistan Army. But in the last 15 years at least, we have failed completely. And the more we attempt to resolve or defeat the enemy, we are caught in a paralysis of analysis. I really don't care whether Mr. Samuel Huntington makes sense or not. I know one thing. There is an enemy who claim to have a civilization and who have utter contempt for anyone whose civilization means happiness and joy. Someone suggested this morning that the attacks on Paris were a direct result of French bombardment of Syria. That was not true. The American gentleman, with all due respect, was referring to a Brazilian cartoon that suggested that. The fact is that ISIS said they attacked Paris because it was a city of sin. Now, when you have people at the intelligentsia, at that level, not clear-headed, in fact, everyone cast in the armor of Chamberlain out to please the enemy and come back with the paper in hand saying peace is at hand, at a time when Hitler was liquidating the Jews, was annexing Czechoslovakia, Bavaria, had its eyes on the entire European continent, and for all the admirers of Hitler's books in India, he had nothing to do with that swastika. I'm amazed that the number of bookstores that sell Mein Kampf in India just alarms me, but that's a separate subject. But let me show you something that today illustrates the abject cowardice of a people who are more interested in pro-sport and their summer vacations and their comfort and their air conditioning than any other place, any other value. And let me show you this one slide. I had asked my wonderful colleague over there to present it. This, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Great Britain that once ruled the world. And this picture is from yesterday. If you do not have a spine to upright yourself, Mr. Cameron, stand aside and go work for one of the many consultancies that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia operates, and where the government of Pakistan can buy an American Undersecretary of State for $1 million. The West is for sale. If this current leadership had been there, we would have been under Nazi rule, and Hirohito would have been the emperor of India. And he wouldn't have left you with Netaji. Trust me. If you think somebody did a conspiracy against Subhash Chandra Bose, no, we were gun fodder. We have an enemy, and I don't care what we define the other side. That enemy is the people who believe that life begins after death. Now, some of you believe in that, but you have a return ticket. You might come back. My people just want to go and have a party there. And you can't stop us, because when I asked my daughter at University of Toronto how she compares the Hindu and the Sikh and the Muslim, who are her colleagues in Toronto, she said something quite compelling. She said, Dad, almost every Sikh wants Khalistan and would never like to live there. Almost every Muslim would like to have a khilafah, a caliphate, and would like to live there. Every Hindu young man wants to be a CEO, and every Hindu young woman wants to be his wife. I can assure you that not one of the Indo-Canadians of the Hindu persuasion is interested in anything other than personal wealth and accomplishment. If Mr. Cameron upset you, look at your neighbors and tell them, what have you done to stem this flow that nurtures itself in the land of the Indus and the Ganges and nowhere else? And I say that because the great century of Islam was between 1850 and 1950, when after a catastrophic defeat of immense proportions in 1857, the Muslim hard drive had been zapped and there was nothing on it. And they started afresh from Aligarh to understand, both in Egypt and India and in Iran, that wearing trousers, going to university, looking good to your wife, eating with a fork and knife, this whole worship of the past is going to lead you to the past. And they came out till 1950, when almost every Islamic society had one of the most dandiest set of politicians. In fact, the rogue Muhammad Ali Jinnah himself looked smart. The one single man who is responsible today for the catastrophe we face has not yet been identified. And he was born in the Indian subcontinent. His name is Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He created the first Islamic state. You should know that. But the Indians seem to have forgotten that the Indus does not flow in India anymore. You've conveniently withdrawn yourself to the Wagha-Atari border and said, Yehi hoga Hindustan. Whereas Lahore, the city of Lord Rama, is not even in your hands. You don't have the Indus. Half your Punjab, that's the first word in your national anthem, is not in your hand. The Sindh that you talk about, most Indians sing, is Saraswati River. It's the reality that you have abandoned. And I'm addressing this specifically to an Indian audience, because this war will be won and lost in India, not in Arabia. Because, and I'll tell you why. Because it is only in India that a Muslim can stand up and address an audience and not fear that my neck will be chopped off. Why? Because Islam, Muslims and Hindus are intermarried to an extent that there is no provision for divorce. And the Islam of India allows Ghalib and Nazir Akbar Abadi and the great poets like Mir Taqi Mir tell God, go to hell. What the hell have you done for us? And yet survive. Bulleh Shah was from the same land where the Mahabharata comes. That's not a coincidence. And it's not a coincidence that the British divided the only part of India where the Hindu and the Muslim knew how to live together, plus added the Sardars, and you had one of the most amazing civilizations that thrived, and Delhi was just a mere shadow of Lahore. But you ensured that we were split because you created an Islamic state. And guess who came to the Islamic state as one of the first guests? The gentleman who refused to share the stage with Professor Pipes today is Tariq Ramadan. He chickened out. His father, Sayyid Ramadan, a Muslim Brotherhood grandson of Hassan al-Banna, was sent to Pakistan. It's surprising Indians don't know this. He was sent to Pakistan to craft the first Pakistani constitution. Who came to help him out? The grandson of a Polish rabbi called Muhammad Asad, who was serving the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Was it not for the Bengali legislatures of the Pakistan Constituent Assembly, you would have the ISIS phenomena 40 years earlier. But we kicked them out. Because you sent us all those Urdustan people to Karachi to civilize the Baloch and the Sindhis and the Punjabis because we were uncivilized people, you see. So you sent your elite Republican Guard to us who created the Islamic State, who created the Islamic Republic of Pakistan that committed a genocide in Bangladesh, and instead of using that catastrophic defeat to crush aspirations of an Islamic State forever, what did India do? They started playing bridge with their fellow Punjabi-speaking Pakistani military officers. Because the Bengalis couldn't speak Punjabi, he said, let them go. We're having a party here. Let's put on Pakiza. There are a few generals over here. I'm not off the mark, I'm telling you. The Bangladeshis are till today bitter that you let go 5,000 war criminals because Benazir Bhutto looks so pretty in Simla. You gifted Pakistan with 90,000 POWs when you could have said, they go back if you make Pakistan a demilitarized zone. You'll have 20 tanks for your National Day parade and 5 jet fighters to go over. That's it. You don't want them? We'll keep these. We've got about 1 billion Indians. We'll keep nurturing the 90,000 till they die. And they can go on the radio and say, hum sab khairiyat se hain. मैं चक चवाली से बोल रहा हूं. सुना होगा आपने. अब करना क्या है? वो लेनिन ने बड़ी अच्छी बात की थी. What is to be done? कुछ हैं या कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी के बचे हुए लोग? You never know. आजकल मजे की बात है, जब हम बच्चे थे तो कम्युनिस्ट गरीब होता था. उसको 100 रुपए महीना कहते थे होल टाइमर. याद है? अब जो मनहूस मिलता है वो साला मिलीनियर होता है. Have you ever met a Marxist who's poor? This is a disease of this 21st century where the enormously wealthy young men tell their dads, I know, Dad, you want me to be vice president, but can I take a sabbatical and go occupy Wall Street? I say, go. Then he goes 1 year, occupy Wall Street, gets 50 Islamists behind him, because nowadays you can buy them a dime a dozen. Then he comes back and he becomes vice president. It's all forgotten. In the meantime, he picks up a few left-wing Pakistani ISI activists, some of whom come to Aman Ki Asha parades over here. Others go to the United States. One of them is the closest ally, advisor to the next president of the United States of America, Madame Huma Abedin. Does any Indian know that? She was Saudi educated. She's never responded to anything of what she was taught in Saudi Arabia. Her father created the Mu'tamar Alam Islami. Nobody wants to question that. Her mother is a rector in a university of Saudi Arabia, where Hillary Clinton goes to say, I'm amazed there are Muslim women going to school. That's absolute delightful. No, you just got $20 million into the Clinton Foundation from these rogues. So it's easy to fight, but you will have to commit. And you have to get out of the paralysis of analysis, and you will have to say, and I'm addressing Indian Muslims, it is your cross to carry. You can't do it, you will end up as Zakir Naik, a fool that people come to listen to and live miserably ever after. Or you have the option to be Nazir Akbar Abadi and Mirza Ghalib and Dara Shikoh. You can follow the Islam of Bulleh Shah and declare yourself to be people of Hindustan who have decided to become Muslim. not people of Arabia who decided to rape India. There's a difference. And trust me, there are Indians today here, Muslims, if only they were willing to sacrifice the wedding invitations that every Indian gets every week. That's the only price you have to pay. And you're unwilling to give it. You're unwilling not to be invited. You're unwilling to be told that Mirza Sahab to bilkul hi pagal ho gaye. Maulviyon ko gaali dena shuru kar diye. And nobody wants to be known as that. So when the room is closed, when the mics are off, anytime there's 100% Muslim population, I'm shocked half of them are atheists. The moment somebody else comes in, a Mr. John D'Souza or Vikram Shah or someone, they say, nahi, aisi baat nahi hai. Hum pe bada zulm hota hai. We become pathological liars. Our friends don't trust us. Our neighbors don't want to buy homes next to us. Our children are being brainwashed in schools. When a Mumbai, if they are Maharashtra nationalists over here, editor puts into our Times the only Indian paper with the guts to print the Charlie Hebdo cartoons was a Muslim woman in a Urdu newspaper. May I ask where she is now? Hiding, jobless, penniless, hunted down. Where are those Bollywood actors, the great Khan brothers? Where are they now? Where are they now? A woman that stood up like a giant of a man and said, to hell with you, I will print the cartoons. She had no place to hide. Where is Taslima Nasreen and in the great refuge of the communist state of West Bengal? Who came up when she was being beaten up in Hyderabad? These are all Muslims of the Indian subcontinent. Why is there not a solidarity with the lone strugglers who are standing up with their lives on the line? I can't even visit Pakistan anymore. My brother had to change his last name. My sister doesn't own me. I've lost my family forever. And I'm not the only one. But instead of fighting the rogue state of Pakistan and dismembering it by supporting the independent struggle in Balochistan, what does even the BJP government of Prime Minister Modi, who I do respect and I support, what do? They keep inviting the same fools from Aman Ki Asha and bring them over here. Anyone who has met a military dictator, has honored him, should not be allowed to enter this great country. If you believe in the two-nation theory, you're persona non grata. If you want a visa, you need to declare, I denounce the two-nation theory of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and I don't give a damn about that. If he can't or she cannot, he is not allowed. ठीक है ना? कोई गलत बात कह रहा हूँ राम साहब? इतनी मुश्किल क्या है? If you want to leave Pakistan, they make you declare that you hate Ahmadi Muslims, right? There are no Pakistanis here, so how would you know? My daughter, who was 6 months old, had needed a passport. She had to declare that Ahmadi Muslims are Israeli agents. They're actually Jews. They're inspired by Hindus. And the 6 month, of course, it's a guy. Just give me 100 rupees. We'll say she signed it. So she made a declaration at 6-month-old baby that, now, if you can get that done, if Natasha's, by the way, she's coming tomorrow to India, she should have to declare, as a Pakistani-born person, that I hereby declare and denounce the racist two-nation theory that amputated the two limbs of historic India. And I beg for, well, I don't need to, but if I was in charge, I would say, and I beg forgiveness for the crimes committed by my ummah. Because I do take ownership of Arabs did great things, Muslims contributed great to mathematics. Yeah, you stole it from one guy, gave it to another, and cut the commission in between? I'm sorry. You wiped out the Egyptian language? You made Egyptians into Arabs overnight? You are anti-India because you couldn't, after 700 years of trying, break the will of the Indian people. Not even the Muslims of India wanted to speak Arabic. Of course, they threw in the script, and everybody now thinks if you can read the Persian script, you're an intellectual. If you just live up to Devanagari script, you're just one of those ordinary, So here's I'll conclude. I know I'm pushing the limits. We have to, as people looking to save Western civilization, trust me, Chinese, Indian, Egyptian, Roman, don't care. The civilization that gives me the insulin that keeps me alive, the civilization that allows my daughter to travel alone in an aircraft that never existed in other civilizations, the civilization that gives you the phone to 20 or 800 million Indians or however, is the civilization that we have to fight for. Somebody yesterday suggested of going back to Bhutan. No one's applying for immigration to Bhutan. Is there anyone here? No. They're going for immigration to Germany. Not even the goddamn refugees want to go to Bhutan. They don't even want Slovenia or Croatia. They want the best. Germany and Sweden. That's where they want to go. So that's the civilization. The French and American Revolution, the Canadian Constitution. That's what the future of humanity should be, where individual human rights and the right to leisure and pleasure are not associated with guilt. To fight that, you will have to make room for Muslims to be able, because it is our fight. You cannot do it. The moment you open your mouth, you will be called an Islamophobe. But the moment I discuss it, the most they can say is, गद्दार है. हम तो हैं गद्दार, अंग्रेज के थे, तो अब तुम्हारे हो गए. इसमें कोई शर्म की बात नहीं है. So, number one, as Indians, you need to make room in your homes and hearts for an independent Balochistan. You cannot have your holiest temple over there and abandon it just because going there would be tough. You don't need to do that. Do you know that not a single Baloch exile has ever visited India because India doesn't allow them to come here? Can you imagine that? You've got people with Hurriyat conference living in your midst. You've got traitors by the dozen. You feed them, you plant them, and your friends are your enemies, and your enemies are your friends. Is this Indian civilization? There's something rotten about it. You've got to support the Kurdish. You've got to stand up and bring it to the United Nations that there are countries being occupied that need freedom. It's not just Gaza. Western Sahara by Morocco, West Papua by Indonesia, Kurdistan by Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and Balochistan by Pakistan and Iran. You got to return this fight on their terms, on our terms, not their terms. Why don't they blow up Islamabad if they have a case of oppression? Because every day Pakistan army kills about 50 Baloch. The Turks are bombing the Kurds while telling the Americans they're bombing ISIS. We need moral clarity, but above all, a spine that David Cameron, as I showed, does not have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fateh. I think I would recommend to Ram Madhav that you arrange for a slightly extended stay for Mr. Fateh. At least I want to expose him to Indian television viewers. I think that will be a particularly that will be a wonderful corrective to the discourse which has taken place. Now, Sadanand, if you can better that act.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the India Foundation. Thank you to Ram Madhavji and Shaurya for having me. And though I'm very grateful to be here, I must start with a complaint, which is that it is, of course, impossible to better that act. So after that uplifting speech by Tarek, it's my unfortunate duty to bring you a little bit down to earth with some boring analysis. But I'll try not to be too boring. I was on a plane as I was boarding a plane at Newark Airport as news of the horrific attacks in Paris emerged. And when I landed, I noticed one thing, which I was worried would happen and really did happen, which is that in the debates around what happened in Paris, just as in the debates before what happened in Mumbai or what happened in 9/11 in New York and Washington, it's as though we in India have learned nothing. And by that I mean that we are still grappling with a language issue. We're grappling with a way to talk about and understand this radicalism that we face. And basically, what it comes down to is two conversations which I think are both extreme and are both wrong. The first, of course, is a kind of piety, a kind of wishful thinking, which says, this has nothing to do with religion. We heard that on this morning in some of the sessions. I wish that were true. It's palpably false. And if anyone thinks it's true, all they need to do is pull up the statement released by ISIS itself on the Paris attacks, where they literally quote chapter and verse and explain the explicit religious reasons for carrying out their carnage. But the second thing, which I think is a mistake, and here I will sort of take an issue with my friend Tarek, is that I don't think we really have a fundamental problem with everybody who happens to believe in life after death. So the other statement that I think is extreme and false is that Muslims are the problem. Now, we don't see this so much in our mainstream media, which is filled with too many people putting out the piety that this has nothing to do with Islam. But on social media, we do see a lot of people claiming that Muslims, all Muslims, 1.6 billion Muslims, are the problem. And I have to say that I disagree with that also. Recently, Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz came up with an interesting book about the state of radicalism in the world. And this is an inexact science. It's very difficult to actually put numbers. But they've attempted to put numbers. I know that Professor Pipes has also done this earlier. And the way they divide the world's population currently, the world's Muslim population, and the size of the radical problem is this. They say there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. About 1.04 billion, so 1,040,000, are what they call conservatives. So it's not as though they're liberals, it's not as though they're going to be out drinking, it's not as though they have gay rights parades, but they're conservatives. That does not mean they are Islamists. The problem we have is with Islamists. You can call it Islamism, radical Islam, political Islam, you can take the term that you pick. But what it essentially means is the drive to order every aspect of state and society by Sharia law. Those are the people we have a problem with. So you have the conservatives who are 1.04 billion. You have the Islamists who Nawaz and Harris estimate at 400 million people. And of that, they think about 10%, maybe 40 million, would support jihad. Now, jihad is simply the armed pursuit of Islamism. So what and a very small percentage, about 160 million, which is about 10%, they estimate, would be open to secularism as we see it. So the problem really is, it's an ideological problem. And the problem is, obviously, with the 40 million who support jihad and the subsection of that 40 million who in fact go out to fight jihad, that's obviously a pressing problem that we can all agree upon. But the challenge, and especially in India, is to convince more people that the problem isn't just those 8 people who landed in Paris. The problem is the larger group, the larger Islamist project, which is represented by groups like the Jamaat-e-Islami, by the Muslim Brotherhood and their various offshoots, that basically stands for the imposition of Sharia as a way of life. Now, I know that there are going to be a lot of questions, and so I'll keep the rest of my comments quite brief. But essentially, I think that there are, when it comes to fighting this phenomenon, fighting this ideology, how do we do that in India? And I would say that there are 4 basic principles, some of which I think most of you will agree with, some of you, maybe not all of you, will agree with. But let me put out what I think are the 4 core principles that we in India are going to need if we are to win this fight. The first is to distinguish between the ideology of Islamism and the faith of Islam. I'm not making the mistake of saying what happened in Paris or what happened on 9/11 has nothing to do with religion. It is, in fact, an interpretation that is based on religion. That's the hard truth. But the flip side of that truth is that it is not the only interpretation of the religion. And we must recognize that there are many, many people who consider themselves to be believing Muslims, who live lives as Muslims and have no interest either in jihadism or in Islamism, and that is a truth that we must acknowledge, and that's a difference that we must not cease to make. The second principle is, flowing from the first, is that we should never condone any violence or bigotry against Muslims. And this comes back to the idea of whataboutery that Swapan spoke about. When something happens, when something is done to a Muslim or to a Muslim community, we should not respond to it by saying, well, how about all the atrocities committed in the name of Islam? There are many atrocities committed in the name of Islam. Nonetheless, it is important, if you want to win this battle in the long term, to occupy the moral high ground, so you do not condone any kind of bigotry or violence against Muslims. The third principle is that ideas matter. Too often we see in India, on our talk shows and in our op-eds, these easy, lazy explanations. Everything that happened is about foreign policy, or it's about poverty, or it's about something or the other. It's about colonialism. But if it is about poverty, how come I don't see villagers from Orissa and Bihar blowing themselves up in restaurants? If it's about colonialism, why don't I see Cambodians and Vietnamese flying jet fighters into buildings? If it's about foreign policy, why was the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, years before the 9/11, years before the invasion of Iraq? It's not about these things. And so the third principle really is, it's about ideology, it's about ideas, and we have to understand that ideas matter. It's not simply the acts that flow from those ideas which tend to garner our headlines. A train bombing in Mumbai, an attack somewhere else, a temple attacked in Varanasi. Those are horrific and they should command our attention. But the focus of the fight has to be not on the acts, but on the underlying ideas. So the third principle is that ideas matter. And the fourth principle, is flowing from that, is that we have to do a better job of encouraging heterodox voices from within Islam. I'm very glad that Tarek Fatah is over here. We have some other brilliant thinkers who have been invited to this conclave, including Tufail Ahmed and Sultan Shaheen. The problem that I see in India every time I switch on the television is that when you have a Muslim representative, it's either Asad Owaisi or Zakir Naik or someone else who basically stands for a fundamentalist interpretation of the faith. We are not able to give enough space to, enough airtime to people who are actually coming from within Muslim communities, coming from within Muslim families, and challenging some of these ideas that lead to violence, lead to terrorism, threaten civilization. So to sum up, I'd like to sort of reiterate that our discourse in India needs to change. Most of the problem is on the left because they're simply in denial. They don't want to talk about this. They don't want to see it for what it is. They don't want to recognize terrorists when terrorists say what they are themselves. The terrorists, by the way, are not apologetic about this. The Islamic State has no problem calling itself Islamic. It's the left that says, it's a sort of it's like a jihadist comes up to you and says that I want to murder you because I want to become a martyr and go to heaven. And the leftist says, no, you really want to murder me because you want a Mercedes. And then the jihadist says, no, I actually have a Mercedes and I still want to murder you. So we have to understand, we have to take these people at face value. We have to take their values we have to take what they say at face value. We have to look at this coldly. We have to look at it rationally. But the flip side of this is that we have to be very careful to distinguish between people who have taken this path. It's a minority. It's a large number of people in absolute terms. It's still a minority in terms of percentage. We've got to keep that difference in mind. If we don't keep that difference in mind, I think it'll be very, very difficult to win this war in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sadanand. I think in addition to your 4 points which you mentioned, I think there's another very crucial thing which you might have omitted to mention, is that is there sufficient realization and recognition that the Islamist threat also poses a danger to India? Professor Pipes talked about Samuel Huntington. He categorized India as a frontier civilization. The Hindu civilization is a frontier civilization. And I think the assumption there was it could swing this way or that. And I think what we have is we seem to be comforting ourselves that as we grow economically, it's surely the power of prosperity which is going to defeat the ideas per se. And it doesn't really require a multitude of people to be convinced. All it requires is a dedicated handful. The Lenin's Vanguard Party converted into an Islamic idiom, which is what it requires, and you can have horrific consequences.
I agree, and I don't think that the trend lines in India are particularly encouraging. I mean, we saw something in the news just today where Azam Khan, this politician in Uttar Pradesh, said that he denounced who he saw as the culprits of the Paris attacks, which of course, according to him, is the United States. The point isn't that this is a politician and he said something inflammatory. The point is that how can someone who says such things find an audience? How is it possible that politicians in Bihar can go campaigning with a lookalike of Osama bin Laden? What does that say? Why does that win you votes and not lose you votes? And I think that many of these things are, why did someone, for instance, again in UP, put a bounty on the head of the Danish cartoonist? So I think in many ways we have sort of tried to insulate the Indian conversation from the global conversation. And I think that's false because it cannot be insulated. You can say that India has had a better experience than many other countries, than say the UK or France when it comes to people joining jihadist groups such as the Islamic State. That's a fair point. But you cannot say that India has been insulated from these winds that have blown across the world all the way from Morocco to Mindanao.
You may have been insulated, but there is a temptation to say, like Azam Khan did, that it's all the fault of America, or, and this is something I want to pose to Professor Pipes, is the belief that everything can be located somewhere in Jerusalem, the problem. And that's the rhetoric which you find over and over again of how much Palestine actually has been a force multiplier for Islamist radicalism, even in India, even though it may not have taken on a terrorist dimension, all that, but you have what is quaintly referred to in the West as non-violent extremists. Do you think that that is a fair assumption?
Islamists divide. Some are focused on Mecca and Medina. Some are focused on Jerusalem. The Salafis, the one with the long beards and the women who are completely covered, they're focused on Mecca. The Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwanis, the ones with beards like mine and women wearing hijabs, they're focused mostly on Jerusalem. It's worth noting, though, were the Arab-Israeli conflict resolved today to general satisfaction, I can't imagine that it would make much difference in terms of the Islamist movement. It is perhaps a conflict that gets people upset, but once they're upset about lots of things. It's a widespread assumption in the Obama administration that if you can solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, then all the other problems of West Asia become easier to solve. I don't think it's true. It would be good to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it would have very little bearing on, say, the civil wars in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. It would have very little bearing to do with the aggression of the Iranian state, and so forth and so on. So it's really not that consequential. And indeed, these days, in contrast to the past, when the words the Middle East conflict are said, it's no longer the Arab-Israeli. The Middle East conflict today is, in effect, Iran versus Saudi Arabia. And Israel is a small part. It's more or less on the Saudi side. So the Arab-Israeli conflict is diminishing in importance. You look at Syria on fire. You look at Turkey becoming a rogue state. You look at Saudi Arabia turning away from its historic ambitions to foment Wahhabi revolutions and so forth. Israel, the Palestinians are off to the side. And indeed, the Palestinians are quite aware of this and trying to get everybody's attention. Hello there, we're still here, but they're not succeeding.
I know we're running against time, and I'll open it up to a discussion generally, at least. So given the paucity of time, what I'll do is I'll take a clutch of questions, and questions, I mean questions, not the Indian interpretation of questions, which is a little more flexible. First, I think Cleo Pascal of Chatham House wanted to make a small intervention on this.
Yes, some of you may have copies of the program with my name in it for this panel. And I'm a journalist, so of course I'm an expert in absolutely everything. But when I saw who was going to be on the panel, I thought it would be better if I sat at their feet and actually just learned from them. So just to explain what that was. I'd like to thank you very much for your courage and clarity on these issues. I do a lot of work, as many of my friends in the room know, in the South Pacific. And the South Pacific, in particular Fiji, is undergoing radicalization now in the Indo-Fijian community. And a lot of the dynamics that you were discussing, you can see on the ground. And it's such a small place that you can see, for example, how essentially an Indic Muslim society is becoming a Wahhabi society. And how the reaction to it, for example, among the Christian Fijians, is creating a really difficult backlash for the Hindu Indo-Fijians and creating more extremism among the Christian Fijians as well. So understanding how it can rapidly escalate in areas that were previously thought to be peaceful is incredibly important. And what can we do to stop that process from rolling out and destabilizing the entire Pacific region and the concurrent difficulties it'll have for the Indo-Pacific societies? Thank you.
We'll club the question. So the lady there, oh, Madhu, sorry. My apologies for not instant recognition.
My first question is regarding the use of the term radicalism. To my mind, the literal meaning of the word radical is to go to the root of things. Aren't we giving a very respectable term for a horrific politics, for terrorism? I don't know why we're calling them radicals. I can understand them wanting a respectable term, but I don't understand why we should do it here. And this become very commonly used term even in our media. So I suggest next time we discuss this, we drop this term and call it by the right name, namely terror. And in India, we've known Thank you, Tarek, for a brilliant presentation. You're right that Jinnah created an Islamic state. But before that, what ISIS is doing, India has had waves and waves of, what happened to the Sikh gurus. It's not very different from what ISIS is doing today in the name of bringing about an Islamic state. But one little point for Daniel Pipes. It seems to me that America has done enough damage to the world in the name of imposing or bringing about democracy, a certain version of democracy. Now, America wanting a certain version of Islam. If only America stopped defining the kind of Islam, because sometimes Taliban seems to you to have the right version of Islam, sometimes the Saudis. So I really think a hands-off policy and letting this battle be fought without the backing of America, there's a much better chance of us winning in the direction in which Tarek Fatah was pointing. Thank you.
Two more questions and then we'll give it to the gentleman there and gentleman here.
I agree with Madhuji very much.
Do you have a question?
1 minute. Do you all agree to define the so-called radicalism as kafirophobia? Because every Muslim sect, kafirophobia, we know Islamophobia. Would you all like to call kafirophobia to be exact, precise, rather than radicalism?
Okay. Could we have a question from?
Sure. We are using the wrong term, and that radical Islam is a wrong term, and this is nothing but perversion of the good value system, and mostly used by Americans using the radical Islam. Islam is Islam. There is no radical Islam. Am I right?
No.
Tavleen and Patrick. Okay.
Tarek, it's for you. You're very right. There was a kind of Indian Islam that produced Ghalib and Mir, and produced Bulle Shah. It's gone. We now have, I live in Bombay on Marine Drive, and before my eyes, I have seen since 9/11 Muslim women now jogging in hijab. And every Muslim man on that road now has a beard. And if you say that Ghalib once said, Khuda ke vaste parda na Kaabe se utha, they think you're mad. So do you have any idea, sorry, I have a very bad cough. Do you have any idea, as a former Indian, Pakistani, whatever, of a way of bringing back what really is the only acceptable form of Islam that will work in India?
Patrick, that's a final question. Mr. French.
Thank you so much. A couple of quick questions. One is, why is Muhammad Ali Jinnah getting the blame when he, if anything, faced down the proto-jihadi movement? Muhammad Ali Jinnah faced down the proto-jihadi movement of people like Maududi and his followers. And Pakistan did not, in fact, become technically an Islamic state until about 8 years after his death. And the second point is about the experience of the very large number of Indian Muslims. I mean, Sadanand touched on this, but I think it's very significant that much, much smaller countries have sent or created so many more international jihadi terrorists. Little countries like Belgium, which has a population of what, about 1 crore people? I mean, in India, you would barely even notice that many. And you can say the same for Germany, you can say the same for Britain, you can say the same for France. I mean, there must be elements of the Indian experience which, if anything, are to be admired and perhaps learnt about by other countries.
Okay, now maybe Professor Pipes, you can take off from Madhu's point about whether the United States should sort of retreat.
I would certainly take great exception to the fact that the United States has done damage by spreading democracy. I would say this is the great pride of American foreign policy over the past century to have helped spread democracy around the world, but that's a discussion for another time. I do agree with you, however, that the notion that we, and particularly our government, our president, gets to decide who's a good Muslim and who's a bad Muslim is a very bad idea indeed. And there should be no attempt by politicians in general, non-Muslim politicians especially, to decide what Islam should be. Complete agreement there. On the question of Fiji, my very brief answer would be find ways to bring down the price of oil, because it is the Iranians and the Saudis who are taking their various radical ideas to remote places like Fiji, and who are promoting it because they have the means to do so. So the sooner they don't have this kind of wealth, the more difficult it will be for them to spread such ideas. Is Islam basically kafirophobia? No. There are many positive elements of Islam, but certainly integral to the faith has been this notion that what is Muslim is superior to what is not Muslim. And that is something that is antique and not workable in the modern world, and modern Muslims need to push out this idea. And it's possible. All religions change over time. Islam has changed over time. Islam has changed, if I'm going to put it so simply, for the worse in the past 50 years, 65 years since 1950. It can get better again. And part of the effort is to de-emphasize and to reject this notion that Muslims are superior to non-Muslims. And finally, is there just Islam and no distinction? This is a very appealing idea. This is what you referred to before when you talked about social media, making no distinction. I think all of us are very clear in making this distinction. It is absolutely essential to make a distinction between the radical forms, fundamentalist, totalitarian, political, militant, Islamist, call it what word you wish, but this form of Islam that seeks the application of the Sharia in its entirety and its severity. This is one form of Islam that attracts perhaps a quarter, as in the book by Harris and Nawaz, or in my estimation, 10 to 15%, whatever the numbers might be. It's a minority. And the point is that it would be a huge mistake to say that this is all Muslims, because as all of us have reiterated, it is only Muslims who will come up with a different understanding of what it means to be Muslim in the 21st century. It is Muslims who will oppose this radical interpretation, who will offer a civilized, a modern, beneficial interpretation. It is Muslims who will do this. If you're to say that all Muslims are the same and they're all hopeless, then you are discrediting and making it more difficult for those Muslims who seek a modern, moderate Islam.
All the Pakistan questions to you, self-professed Gaddar.
Let me go to Fiji and draw a parallel between what's happening in Fiji and what's happening in Trinidad. These are on opposite sides. The Muslims of Fiji and Trinidad, or Guyana, or St. Kitts are all Indian Muslims. You will not find Arab Muslims involved in this issue. This is a phenomena because the Iranian is first an Iranian. The Turk is first a Turk. You will never ever hear a term encompassing all Muslims that said Indians and Muslims. You always hear the term Arabs and Muslims. Why? Because there are Arabs and then there are Arab slaves who are Muslims. And therefore, under Sharia law, the non-Arab is inferior to the Arab, and it is a sin for non-Arab, say Indic or Persian Muslims to consider themselves equal. Now, this is not known. It is one of the most racist constructs that exist today is within Sharia law. Now, whether you like it or not, an iota of honesty amongst Muslims would clarify it. I haven't met a Muslim who's read the Quran in about 45 years of my fight against this. Nobody does. Number one, even if they spoke Arabic, they couldn't read it because it's not in chronological order. There isn't logic to it because it's been put together by the size of the surah. So, who is the prime candidate who does not have an identity? It's the Indian Muslim. It's the follower of Mr. Iqbal, who plagiarized his own tarana to make a Milli tarana, which is now being celebrated by Banerjee. What a disgusting idea. It's happening here. Why is she catering to that? Because she knows, and many of these vote bank politicians know, that it is the Indian Muslim. By Indian Muslim, I mean those who live in historic Indian subcontinent, who have no identity of their own. So if I'm an empty vessel, I can be filled up with Islamism. An Arab would never accept himself in a phrase that said Indians and Muslims. But every Indian Muslim will consider himself to be a member of a phrase that said Arabs and Muslims. The non-Muslim is not even comprehending the enormity of the problem just in the labeling of it. So why is it that Fiji and Trinidad, and in Trinidad you've had the Islamist revolution by a black convert who went from Canada, converted to Islam by Deobandis. He went back to Trinidad and organized a coup and took over the country. But until and unless you understand that the prime recruitment grounds and philosophy of jihad is coming from the ISI in Pakistan, by the Pakistan military, funded by Saudi Arabia, that the Iranians beat themselves merely and nobody else, and that they're considered Jews by the rest of the Muslim population, and that it was only in India that a Shia Muslim could be a Shia Muslim, then you will understand that the real problem is Saudi Arabia, but it is considered both by Israel and the United States as the good guy. So we have a dearth of Muslim presence in the policy making, even in the debate. Nobody wants us there. Someone like me is too good looking to be considered an authentic Muslim. You have to be ugly to be considered authentic. Now, as far as the question by Mr. French is concerned, Muhammad Ali Jinnah was an Islamist in the same way as Imran Khan is. Imran Khan would like a woman a day. Mr. Jinnah, who ran away with his friend's daughter, a pedophile, wanted his wife's plunging necklines to please the governor of Bombay. So this is the beer drinking, bacon eating, whiskey loving, Parsi marrying Islamist who's called a Muslim nationalist. He or she doesn't have to pray. These are the Communist Party of India, Sajjad Haidars, the cadre of Adhikar doctrine that came to create Pakistan. In Punjab, the cadre of the Muslim League was the Communist Party of India. They didn't believe in God or Muhammad, but they were Muslim nationalists. Unfortunately, that the authors, the intelligentsia of the West, who think they know, I'm sorry, you haven't got a clue. You go to Islamabad, you get feted so much biryani, so much whiskey, and so much money that you come out with 5 former ambassadors to Pakistan who wrote a letter against Aisha Siddiqui. You remember that? People have been bought and sold on that market simply because the Pakistanis are doing a brilliant job in fooling the Indians, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Saudis. Do you know of any other country who could simultaneously do that and get away with it? So, Turkey at its worst would still be an Ottoman empire. The Persians, if they'd gone crazy, would at the most take over the Musa Island somewhere in the Persian Gulf, right? That's the worst. The Arabs, at their worst, would not do anything. The Pakistani has a nuclear bomb, for crying out loud. He's got 200 nukes, half of them targeted at Tel Aviv, and they want us to believe it's actually targeted at Nicobar Islands. Can you imagine the fools who believe that it is at Nicobar and it's not 2,600 miles at Israel? They got tactical nuclear weapons that go at 50 miles. Goa is in their sight because those tactical nuclear missiles are boat-ridden missiles. You live next to the monster And you think the monster lives somewhere in Arabia. No, he lives across the border. It's far more complicated than it seems. And the tragedy is that the Hussein Haqqanis or the Farhanaz Isfahanis, the people who know what is rotten in the state of Pakistan, are not the ones who will ever get on to Arnab's show. Right? It's impossible. It's impossible for, what's her name? Barkadat. Can you imagine Barkadat interviewing me? No way. I'm too good looking. But one final word. I think Tavleen had that observation. Why are they wearing bade bhai ka kurta or chote bhai ka pajama? Nobody wants to look ugly, especially their girlfriends. Well, they don't have girlfriends. That's why they die, to get girlfriends. So the question is, why are educated women wearing the niqab who were born in the United States? Who are these conehead hijabis? You know what I'm talking about. These are not the pious hijabis who got flat heads and a tight hijab. I'm talking of the women who pays $200 to get a hair done and then gets covered up by a hijab. You must have noticed them. On stilettos, red lipstick, blue mascara, eyeshadow, fast blinking eyes, expensive glasses right where they should be, and with a white boyfriend. You've seen them all. Who go with the Quran in their hand and are having temporary marriages in North America. Because temporary marriage is part and parcel of Sharia law. And I can say that you can't, because I'm a Muslim and you're not. So you got an entire sexual revolution within Islamic world, but it's covered up by niqab. Now look at the paradox. The 15-year-old Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian girls who are sleeping around with unfamiliar jihadis were the same ones who said, I can't go on a prom date, you know. It's my religion. She went from bed to bed. For what? For the pleasure of the Prophet and service of Islam. And the answer then is not about percentages of how many. The facts that Sutherland said were 100% right. My issue is I don't have a problem with my grandmother believing that a horse can fly. What does it matter to me? My problem is that there are international constitutional laws today, governed first in Pakistan, instituted in the Constitution of Pakistan, that determine these laws as having been true. Until and unless we stand up for secularism and the separation of religion and state. Secularism should not mean all religions are equal. And India is not a secular state, because you can get an FIR cut against me for having insulted, because I have insulted quite a few number of people today. I could get arrested as I got out. Not in the United States. You need the establishment clause of the first amendment of the US Constitution to take as a symbol of Western and human civilization. Then you can say church and mosque and politics are separate. I don't give a damn whether the snake speaks, the monkey flies, or the horse flies. It's immaterial. But you have the right to believe that, but you cannot ask the state legislature of Iowa or Ohio to say that when they pass a law saying no Sharia law, that is racism. No, it's not. We defeated Sharia in Canada in a handful of people. But we were able to diffuse anti-Islam rhetoric because Muslims did it. Canada is the only Western country you will find absolutely no anti-Muslim feeling. Why? Because the appetite for someone to stand up against these monsters is taken by Muslims. If we stand firm against the jihadis, why should it be someone who's a right-wing neo-Nazi? He doesn't even need to do anything, because we're doing this, the duty. In India, the fight against Islamism should be Javed Akhtar's job. The Khan families. you know, Seema Zaidi or whatever her Mustafa, whatever her name is. Where are these women feminists? Where is Javed Anand? All of these people have become subservient to the same philosophy that sends these jihadis in Fiji and Trinidad to blow themselves up. And India is the only place, I don't want to say this because I'm trying to please you, but that's the reality. There's no place. Only in Israel or in India can a Muslim stand up and speak the truth. Believe me. Now this is odd, but that's the fact.
Let me get, so your South Pacific question is very interesting, and I'm going to sort of try and link that to Madhu's point about the US. You know, what's happening in the South Pacific, I'm not an expert over there, but it's very similar to what we've seen happen in Indonesia, which I'm very familiar with over the past generation. And what you see is these older Indic, more relaxed forms of Islam giving way to harsher, Arabized, more orthodox forms of Islam. The most obvious explanation, of course, is the fact that the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris and so on are very active in seeding mosques and so on. And what they follow is a kind of venture capital model where you see this sort of, I mean, it's fascinating. You can almost see this in real time, where a single preacher will be taken from a village, go to Saudi Arabia, he'll come back, he'll get a grant from the Saudi government, they'll set up a Wahhabi mosque. Before you know it, the burqa start coming on. Before you know it, the old sort of ways of worship are seen as too pagan or tinged with paganism. There's a part in my book where I went to, this is in Central Java, in the hills of Central Java. I was taken secretly by a local person who still practiced the old Hinduized shamanistic form of Javanese Islam. And he took me to a small cave. This was in 2004. He took me to a small cave where President Suharto used to pray. 20 years earlier, President Suharto had taken an Australian Prime Minister. It may have been Bob Hawke, I've forgotten, I don't know which one. He had taken an Australian Prime Minister with him to show the special relationship between the two countries. And he said, I'll take you to my most sacred spot, which is this ancient cave where I'll go pray. 20 years later, the guy who had the keys to that cave was skulking around like a criminal because the surrounding area had been taken over by Wahhabi mullahs, and now his practice, which was the older practice, which traces itself, in fact, back to Parikshit and the Mahabharata, was now deemed as heretical. So part of it comes from the push, but there's also, you know, if we're sort of honest about it, there's an element of pull. It's not as though everybody is just being beaten on the head and said, well, you know, you must take this. I think the ideas of Wahhabism, they may appear, and they are, of course, you know, repellent and barbaric to us, but they are, in fact, quite attractive to the people who follow them. In my book, I travel with a young Javanese Wahhabi. Now, there was a time when that would have been an oxymoron. You could not be a Javanese Wahhabi. Now you can be a Javanese Wahhabi, just as you can be a Bangladeshi Wahhabi, unfortunately. But, you know, there's something about and I think, you know, Professor Pipes talked about this. There's something very attractive about certainty. And that certainty is so powerful that it draws people because it gives them an answer for all of life's complexities and all of life's questions. This comes back to the idea of, you know, whether the US should be involved. And I agree with Madhu that certainly the US has made many policy blunders and has definitely not covered itself in glory in the post 9/11 era when it comes to radicalism, which seems to be growing by leaps and bounds. But if you bring this back to the idea of seeing this as an ideological battle, seeing this as something that has to be waged for a very long time against a determined and very wily foe, then the question is, would I rather have the United States on my side or not? And the answer is, I would much rather have the United States on my side, provided there is a clarity of understanding of what the problem is, the kind of clarity that we see on this stage. Unfortunately, we do not have that clarity of understanding, and unless we have that clarity of understanding, we're not going to make progress.
last minute.
Yeah, I want to address Madhu's question. The United States of America single-handedly created two Muslim countries in the heartland of Europe, Kosovo and Bosnia. It came to the aid of those who were committing a genocide. The United States of America was the one country that stood in the way of the United Nations Security Council resolutions on Kashmir. People seem to forget it used to be a Soviet veto that would save India for many, many years, right up to the mid-60s. It was the USA that came out and supported the right of so-called self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and the plebiscite. Now, it is easy to forget it, but the facts don't stand that. It is the United States of America that came out and saved Egypt in 1956, during the Suez Crisis. The Americans were not with Israel. The Israelis didn't have American armaments at that time. So it is incorrect and dangerous to accuse the United States, because the United States itself is not an entity in terms. Many of their politicians and the congressmen from both sides of the House have spoken up. Senator Ted Kennedy single-handedly created a climate in which Bangladesh and Bangladesh's problems rose to the surface, and his services to Bangladesh's independence and Islamic country are borne out over there, are remembered by the tree that is now called Kennedy in the Dhaka University campus.
Well, I'm sure we've just only skimmed the surface of a very, very engrossing, enthralling, and a subject which is likely to be discussed on and on. But I think you'll all agree that this has been one of the most fascinating sessions of this conclave. And I would urge you all, I would first urge Ram Madhav to ensure that we get these people back again, number one. And number two, I would urge you all to give a very, very generous hand to all three of them, Daniel Pipes, Tarek Fateh, Sadanand Dubey.